Hello, mortals! I am the booktube goddess, the #1 drag queen booktuber on YouTube. 'Tis the season to be tagged, I guess. I was tagged by Sarah of Voyage Through Words or Worlds, and Sarah tags me often and I tag her, so I guess it's my turn. The original tag is by Daniela of Only If for a Page. I don't know this booktuber very well, but I'm going to be sure to check them out. This is the contradiction book tag, so it's contradictory feelings when you look at a book or something like that. We'll get into it. Let's look at the first prompt.
The first question is, I love this genre, but I didn't like this book.
Now, my favorite genre is fantasy, and the book that comes to mind is Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. And I picked it up, it looked interesting, had a gorgeous cover, and it was getting some hype, and I didn't like the book. And I read the entire thing. I just felt, well, the biggest issue for me was I wasn't really connecting with the main character. I didn't really care about her that much. And I kept seeing potential in the story, but in the end, it felt like a lot of buildup to some very generic fantasy themes. So yeah, it was hard for me to get through it, and I pushed myself through, and afterwards I was not impressed.
Question number 2 is, I rarely read this genre, but I love this book.
I'm going to pick historical fiction because that is a genre that I almost never read, and I believed I did this as a prompt for a readathon some years back, and historical fiction was the prompt, and I picked Burr by Gore Vidal. Now, I've read Gore Vidal before. I liked his fiction a lot. He's the one that did Myra Breckenridge, which is a disaster of a movie, but a hilarious psychedelic book. He did another really great psychedelic book, Duluth, and the first book he ever published, The City and the Pillar, which I read back in college, is a novel with a gay main character that was, I guess, groundbreaking at the time. Very interesting novel to read, especially now. But keep in mind, this was published in the 50s. And if you don't know who Gore Vidal is, please look him up on YouTube or on Google, because he is a fascinating progressive thinker and philosopher, and he gets into lots of fights, sometimes physical fights with conservative pundits like William F. Buckley, and I think he had beef with Norman Mailer. I think they actually did get into a physical altercation where Norman Mailer punched Gore Vidal, and then Vidal famously said, "Once again, words fail Norman Mailer." Anyway, Burr is the first novel that he wrote in a series of books that is the novelization of American history. This one about Aaron Burr, who famously, of course, shot Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. And if you've seen the musical version of Hamilton, the Gore Vidal version of Hamilton and Burr is much different. And he takes these really cutting satirical looks at some of our noted historical American figures like George Washington, of course, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, but also, I believe, Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. And it's a fascinating book to read, and I surprised myself by how much I enjoyed it.
Question number 3 is probably the question that gave me the most difficulty, and that is, I love this trope, but I didn't like this book.
I'm going to have to say the chosen one trope. I do like a good chosen one trope, going back to King Arthur. So, and I like them a lot in middle grade books because that's a trope that you often see in middle grade fantasies. And I picked up a book by two well-known young adult authors, Holly Black and Cassandra Clare, and this was called The Iron Trial. And I was very underwhelmed by this book. I was expecting this light middle grade fun read, but it felt so derivative of Harry Potter. It's about a young boy who goes to this magic school, and he's chosen for reasons. There's a bit of a plot twist in it, but I felt the book was very paint by numbers. So I didn't go back to that series and kind of turned me off to both Holly Black and Cassandra Clare, even though I did read Cassandra Clare's Mortal Instruments and I did enjoy the first 3 books. I think that's as far as I got into it though.
Question number 4 is of course the opposite. I hate this trope, but I love this book.
Well, I don't know if there's a trope I actively hate, but I am tired of seeing love triangles. But when I read the Daevabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty, I enjoyed this book immensely, or the series immensely, and it does have a very significant love triangle, but it's also integral to the plot. It's not gratuitously thrown in. And if you don't know what the Daevabad trilogy is, it's a fantasy set in a Muslim setting. And it draws on a lot of Middle Eastern mythos like genies and jinns and ifrits and the City of Brass. I found it highly enjoyable and certainly recommend it to anyone interested in fantasy.
Question number 5. I love this author, but I didn't like this book.
There is an author a while ago that I really loved, and that is Piers Anthony. And Piers Anthony, I first started reading him way back when he first started his Xanth series, but I also loved his Red Adept series. And he did this science fiction series, which is pretty good, called Chthon or something like that. So I was a big fan of Piers Anthony. And I was even reading a lot of his, I think it's called The Instrumentalities. That got a little boring because it was the same story told by different points of view in each novel of the series. But then he wrote something called Bio of a Space Tyrant. And I DNF'd that book. And I thought it was so awful. And it was a lot of pontification of Piers Anthony's politics, and not that I had anything against it, but it was just so heavy-handed and the writing was so dense, not like anything I've read by Piers Anthony before, and I never picked up another Piers Anthony book.
Question number 6 is, I previously disliked a book by this author, but I loved this book.
This was a hard one for me to figure out because usually if I dislike a book by an author, I don't pick up another book. But what comes to mind is the author John Bellairs. And I picked up his middle grade books for a Believe-a-thon a couple years ago or a year ago. And that was The House with a Clock in the Wall. And I think I did the sequel as well. The House with a Clock in the Wall is a movie with Jack Black that was relatively recently filmed. But the middle grade novels were written in the 70s with a young protagonist named Louis Barnevelt. And I didn't like the middle grade novels that much. I didn't find them engaging. It didn't have that whimsy that I like in middle grade books. And they weren't bad, but I just didn't like them. But then when I was researching this author, I found out that he did write one adult fantasy novel, The Face in the Frost. And I found out that it was an inspiration for Dungeons and Dragons. And if you don't know the history of Dungeons and Dragons, it basically was popularized by Gary Gygax, and Gygax had a list of books that were his inspiration in developing the spell systems and other type of lore in his game Dungeons and Dragons, one of which was The Face in the Frost. So I, of course, had to pick it up, read it, and I was completely enchanted. This one did have sort of almost a literary quality to it. It was very whimsical, almost Alice in Wonderland-like. And it wasn't a children's novel, it is an adult novel, but there was just something very lyrical about the writing and the story, and I was completely blown away. I didn't realize I was going to like it as much as I did.
Question number 7 is, I love this cover, but I don't like this book.
I think I talked about this in another tag video, but I'm going to bring it up again. Trashlands by Alison Stein, because I loved the cover, and when I read the blurb, I loved the premise of the book. It's post-apocalyptic after an ecological disaster where technology is no longer high-tech, it's very low-tech, and there's no oil, therefore there's no plastic, and people are collecting plastic because it's a rare commodity now, and they ship it off to these factories where there's child slaves, pretty much, child labor, that takes the plastic and turns them into bricks. Now, what they do with the bricks is they use it to build houses, which was very odd to me because, I mean, there is still clay, and I think there are trees, but there are other much easier options to have housing materials rather than plastic bricks. But more than that, I did not care for the main character, and the plot was a character-driven plot, so there wasn't much plot development. It was very slow moving. So in that type of book, if you don't connect with the main character, there are issues. So I had a lot of issues with Trashlands.
And the last one is I don't like this cover, but I love this book.
Well, there is a duology where this fits, and it is The Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green and the sequel, A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor. Now, I stayed away from these books because I thought the covers were so ugly. It's basically just this huge blocky font with these ugly neon colors around them. And I thought the covers were just so ugly that, like I said, I stayed away from them. But I kept hearing about these books and Hank Green, so I finally broke down, got the books, thought they were pretty good. Science fiction, near future, first contact about these aliens that sort of appear on Earth in the form of these statues of samurais, but no one knows what they mean or how to communicate with the aliens. But it does make a connection with this one woman, and I forget her name, but this is her story. But there's a couple of points of view with the people around her. But if I didn't hear any reviews or see other booktubers talk about these books, I probably would never have picked them up. Let's go ahead and tag some people. Let's tag Steph of Coffee Over Apples. We tag each other on these tag videos off and on, and she's a great booktuber. And of course, let's tag Eric of Break Even Books, because why not? And how about Fit to Be Read? Because I'm kind of curious how he's going to answer some of these contradictory prompts. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you're not subscribed already, and hit that notification bell. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.